certainly use a portion of the major maintenance money to augment what is in the bond debt reimbursement funds. If there was a project that needed a little bit more money, it certainly could be taken. It's all for capital improvements, so same color of money.
Mr. Anderson, just to clarify, so this list is out of our current CIP
that is
plan?
That is correct.
Okay.
This was out of the current CIP, and also I believe, I know the vast majority of it was on the bond that failed.
Okay.
But I don't know that every single one of these, I didn't go back and crosswalk that, but it was on the initial list we brought before the bond was amended last year.
Okay, thank you. Other questions before we continue? Member Lessons.
Thank you. Just so to clarify, the number of vestibules, the number of roof improvements would be the same as what we saw on the bond. We're talking the same sites, the same projects, essentially.
That is correct. Okay. To include the camera improvements was also the same schools. Although, frankly, we all know we could have an early snow in September. A roof could have issues, and between now and 6 weeks from now, the prioritized list could change, as it did last year in September.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so for the next two slides, I did want to spend a little time, maybe 10 minutes, and walk through what I see as the timeline of events. If you look at this particular calendar, you'll see the dark blue line designates the far left as those events that will happen in August, September, followed by October. All across the top are those public tasks and events where board members will either be involved or certainly be aware and to be looking for outcomes on things like surveys. If you look on the middle block, the light brown, those are things involving communications, either at board level or staff level. And for the most part, we're putting staff level actions that need to occur. And then on the bottom, you'll see key staff tasks. You will see some red stars throughout here, and those indicate significant staff or board events. So if we look across the top from August, we are more than halfway through August, but the good star, the best star of this whole brief, of course, is that classes start this Thursday. If you look below that under communications, we have already posted a Budget Solutions webpage, and every time we have a board meeting or a finance meeting or we have new information that's been made available to the board, we will ensure that that continues to get updated, providing the most transparency and the most information we can to the community. And then when you look at the staff tasks, one that's missing is closing Ursa Major and the staff focusing on buses for the past 8 straight days. But these are tasks associated with Budget Solutions. If you move towards September, at the very beginning of September, will be the first round of surveys that goes out to the public and or internal to our own district. At that meeting, I'll be providing with probably several others some refined timelines as they become flushed out, the number of schools that the administration is analyzing for potential closure or repurposing, and then an initial list of the programs and costs that we've been able to analyze at that point. You will see from the very first meeting in September all the way through December that a lot of these things won't have all the information up front. So we'll brief a program, and there may be a lot of questions, but I just want to point out that we'll provide more updates over the next 3 months. I think Member Donnelly has a question.
When you say closing or repurposing, how much do we actually have the ability to close a school and not provide an opportunity for that facility to be transferred over to a charter school?
Through the president to Member Donnelly, that's exactly what repurpose means. You could repurpose a school for charter schools like AMCCS, who's clearly on a second floor at East High School. You could repurpose it by putting a lot of district programs all in one place. Like the ACT program is in 5 different places across the district with multiple leases. So as a cost savings measure, it might be more efficient to combine those programs in one location. But as we go further through here over the next few months, I think you'll see these start to fall out on the plate as possible options that the district is doing assessments. So I would caution, though, the first time that we put something out, the staff will continue to analyze that. So if we get a lot of questions on something for a deep dive, I probably will remind the board that over the next few months, you will see more information on each of the programs. So we'll take your collections, but we can't stop the staff effort and focus on one program as the only thing we do as we roll through it. So some of these we know will be very emotional to the public, but in September, we'll have an initial laydown with some analysis that will continue. When you get to October, as you move to the right, you'll see that we will name the schools that the administration is recommending for consideration for closure or repurpose. At that briefing, although we'll list the names of the schools, we may not have everything fluffed out to include what are all the options available for repurposing, because frankly, the same staff working on all of these is really the same people.
So at that time, will there be an analysis, some sort of survey of the charter schools to see which ones are going to exercise their legal option under state law to move into one of those schools that we're listing for closure or repurposing?
We may not, for one, at that point in time, we may not have all the district options to consolidate our own internal programs. So I don't think that we would come up and state that these are available to charters first and then combining programs. Then there wouldn't be anywhere to combine the programs. So our first effort is to reduce overall district costs. The charter schools only pay a 4% indirect for all the efforts that the district provides for them. So they're not our first priority if there's other things we can do to eliminate costs. The lease for this building is $4.5 million a year and growing. Certainly, as we look at possible options to someday relocate the Ed Center, saving $4.5 to $5+ million a year in the long run is a bigger cost savings than potentially handing over a facility. So the list is going to be all inclusive before, I think it'll be November, December before you see the administration recommendation for the final repurposing. Although I'm certainly aware that there are going to be people applying pressure to board members to get those facilities before we've completed our assessment.
Okay. And so would under repurposing, would expanding our pre-K programs be part of that? Could potentially be part of that.
We are certainly talking about that.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. You may continue.
Okay. So you can see down the bottom, obviously in the middle of September, we will have briefed all principals and leadership potentially impacted by a list of schools that gets announced in the beginning of October. We'll always, we will do everything we can to keep the leadership informed so they're not surprised, and to keep the board informed so they're not surprised. And anytime we can foretell something, either in finance committees or during the briefings, we'll certainly do that. The last thing Dr. Bryant wants is people being surprised, specifically the board, who has some incredibly difficult decisions to make this year, and our leaders who lead this district every day. So if you look at November through January, I won't touch too much on these other than the last public town hall will be in December so we have time to collect the data and the information from these monthly surveys and provide it to the board when we brief the pro forma in mid-December, where we'll get final board guidance or just comments. Because once we get into January, it is pretty much an all-consuming effort, closing everything and coming out with the 600-page budget book. And as we've done for the last 6 years, we will plan on at the end of January, as soon as we have the preliminary budget done, schedule one-on-one briefings with board members, collect your comments, your concerns, your information, again, so we can avoid surprises from both sides, from every side, as we go into the February briefing. And I think certainly everyone here in this room is well aware that we're going to pass a budget in February by charter. The Assembly is going to pass it in March by charter. And we're going to come up with whatever it is, knowing that there's a very high likelihood for one-time funding or some other state solution to include a BSA increase that will come months later. So this timeline for us will not stop in January, but continue all the way up through the last day of the legislative session and when the governor signs the last bill, in case we have to reverse something or make modifications. So that's how I see the plan happening. And I think early on, we have to recognize that February is prior to the state making decisions on additional funds, that we go by state statute, that we do everything we can to preserve funds if they're not critical towards softening that deficit, knowing that there certainly could be a solution at state level that comes out after we pass this.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Any other questions? I mean, I have one. Member Lessons.
Is there a URL that's the budget solutions are easily accessible on yet? Is that known?
There is. I clicked on the link. We'll make sure that gets out. I've only clicked on it, but because I built all the slides, I didn't look. But we'll make sure everyone knows that it'll be in Board Connect and be on the front-facing webpage.
Great.
So now we're back to this slide, and unless there's a
Member Jacobs, did you have a question before we
thank
continue?
you, Madam President. And the question is about the slide. Jim and Andy, could you talk through what the average property tax, what it means for us to utilize the school bond debt reimbursement funds for debt service versus utilizing the funds for capital projects and then having a bond holiday?
We can look at that in a variety of ways and put it in Board Connect. I don't have that off the top of my head.
Thank you. And then,
and we'll do it in terms of dollars per 100,000, the way we do the bond flyers and everything else.
Okay, thank you, sir. Madam President,
I'm sorry, could you ask that again? I didn't capture it just
sure,
so I could
just
come
the
back to it.
financial impact, depending upon how the board utilizes the school bond debt reimbursement funding for debt service versus utilizing it for capital projects and then considering a bond holiday.
Got it. Thank you.
And then one follow-up, Madam President.
Yes.
I'm curious if there's any conversation with municipal administration regarding the school bond debt reimbursement funds at all, and anything that the board should know about.
There hasn't been, but I'm working to schedule a meeting now with their chief of staff, their CFO, and their OMB to give them an update on this, because they weren't tracking it as closely as I was through the session. But I wanted to wait until after this board meeting to discuss that with them. So I'm unaware of any other informal or any other discussions with them.
Thank you both.
So when we come back to this slide, hopefully this is about half of the entire board session. I thought it would be good to discuss, because the $16 million for operating funds, I know that there are a lot of interested people within the community that certainly try to encourage the board to use money whenever it's available. So I was hoping we could address that first, so we could plan on whether we should assume this will likely be preserved and saved to soften the fiscal year 24 budget, or if the board believes as a group of more than 4 if it's probably going to be spent down, so we can look at the deficit. And remember, the deficit for 68 million was assuming that none of this money was spent this fiscal year. The deficit that was closer to 100 million assumed that the board did want to spend this one-time funds. So I will hand that discussion over to the board.
Okay. Any comments? Member Higgins?
You know, my view is I appreciate that we have to maintain and adjust and come down and try to do that in a reasonable way. But I also think that we're putting kids first and academic outcomes are critical. And if we need to adjust earlier and we need to do that to put funds into options to address the academic scores, we have to do anything that we have to do. If that means that looking ahead, we know 2024, we know what we're facing with issues, we get there earlier so that we have the funds to address curriculum or other changes, whatever it is we need to do to be creative, we owe that to the kids that are in right now, because we're not getting academic results that are acceptable to our outcomes. We're impacting futures. So I don't know what it's going to take, but as far as worried about saving for what to make it softer for the future to maintain, I hate to use the word status quo. I'm not worried about status quo. I'm worried about outcomes. And I'm worried about getting those outcomes, doing whatever we have to do. And if that means addressing what is obviously going to be a crisis for us earlier to achieve that, that's where I'm coming from. Everything is focused on how do we improve outcomes for kids. And if whatever it takes to do that, I am not worried about softening the blow. I'm probably more worried about accelerating it so that we can have it there and have a larger amount of money for discretion with a plan to deal with the academics than anything else. We owe it and we are not getting the results. So status quo is not something I'm interested in at all.
And yeah, thank you, Member Higgins. Other comments relative to the, member, did you have, yes, go on.
Thank you,
Member Dunn.
Well, if we could identify lower priority areas in this fiscal year, we could make adjustments within this fiscal year to address academic issues. And I'm always open to that. If we can find other places to cut and, shifting that into priorities that would actually produce better outcomes for our students, I'd be really open to that and not have to wait for the next fiscal year.
Sorry, Mr. Anderson.
Yes, ma'am. Actually, the staff will be looking at that in depth and with the exact same reasoning in mind, that if we can find things that we don't need to do, even though it was budgeted, but it can be used for something else, then that would make sense. And I didn't mean to imply that if a board signs a board memo saying that you should put that in fund balance, that it doesn't mean other priorities aren't going to happen. Changing future board decisions sometimes 3 days later. It's just so we can figure out what our starting point is for the deficit. Was it 68? So for instance, if by October we have several things that equal $10 million, then we're down to 58 million as a starting point. If we also were able to save 5 to 10 million in cost avoidance, then it's going to be down to 48 million as our current starting point with everything on that platter, right? It doesn't mean that the board will say yes to everything on that platter, but ultimately over the course of the next 3 months, the plan is to provide a lot of different options, many of which you will not choose to reduce or cut. Some of those options will actually recommend growth in areas that are working. But we just really are trying to get, what does that starting point look like? So as we build this platter of things that might have to be taken off to get to a zero balance budget, by December, we should be looking at everything that we could find district-wide before we ever look at classrooms, right? Because the last thing you want to look at is that. So it certainly is not an intent to promise no one will touch it, because we don't know what's going to happen. But I did want to explain that.
Thank you. Member Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to make sure I'm framing the question correctly, are we first addressing kind of the board's will regarding the first tranche of 16 million?
Mhm.
Is that right?
That's
Okay.
correct.
Yep. And so I know we haven't started outcome monitoring yet. I guess my question to the administration, I'm going to probably flip it a bit and say that my inclination, I mean, we have aggressive, to speak to Member Higgins' point, we have aggressive goals regarding improving student outcomes, and those will have interim measures that we'll be evaluating this year. And so if we have the ability and the superintendent and staff's determination to meet those while preserving that 16 million for fund balance, I think that that's a reasonable course of action. But if our interim goals are at risk, which in turn puts our strategic vision at risk, I think that's probably the line in the sand for me. And so I would ask for a recommendation from staff, at least on this tranche.
Sure, and I'm happy to speak briefly to that. Essentially, I do think it is possible to preserve for the reality that we'll have fewer dollars coming into the district going into next year. I do think we need to start an aggressive evaluation of our current practices around, some districts call it a curriculum audit. Some people call it an internal assessment to understand where we're at and what do we need to pull back on and what do we need to modify. I think we can do both at the same time because really what I'm most alarmed about is the fact that the ESSER funds are going to be spent down and we're still going to have a $60 to $100 million deficit. There's no way around it.
Madam President, can I follow up?
Sure.
Yeah, with hearing that answer, then I think that's my inclination, is to soften that blow, at least to the extent that 16 million will. Thank you.
Yes, Member Holloman, and then Lessons.
And this is, I guess, just a technical question, but historically there was a state cap on fund balance. I know that got suspended during COVID. Is that suspended for the foreseeable future? Or?
It is, through the president to Member Holloman. It's extended at least through FY25. And there is no cap right now.
Thank you. Member Lessons.
Yeah, I wanted to continue my support. I think that I expressed in the Finance Committee meeting for saving the $16 million. One of the numbers that keeps coming back to me from our budget discussions for the FY23 budget is that we're using $56 million in ESSER funds for our teachers. And if we didn't have those funds, we'd be in a world more of hurt. And so I'd like to act defensively with an eye towards our class sizes in coming years.
Thank you, Member Lessons. Let's see, Member Donnelly.
Thank you. I also expressed support for saving the 16 million to soften the impact in the next fiscal year at the Finance Committee meeting, but I'd continue to support that.
I also support that. I don't think Member Wilson has any questions right this minute.
I do not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
So normally Andy and I always follow in order because that's what money people do. You start at the top and you work your way down. But since Member Lessons did bring up, I think it was Member Lessons, the discussion about could major maintenance funds also go toward capital improvements, I think it makes more sense to go back to either stay here or look at that list as board members want to go back and forth as to some of the capital construction priorities for the district, because the options really are to preserve, to reduce taxes, spend all or a portion towards capital shortfalls. It was brought up, and hopefully we get some idea from the board. I believed that the majority were leaning towards a bond holiday if these funds were used toward capital projects. And then finally at the bottom, there is always options to preserve for other school board priorities. So I am curious how the board feels about it, what your inclinations are. And we can stick on this slide, or we can go back to the one on capital projects as a discussion slide.
So when you say bond holiday, that simply means we will not ask for a bond in 2024 or 2023.
I think it would mean that when the board decided that they were going to spend these funds, that part of the messaging and communication plan would, as discussed at the finance meeting, be some sort of commitment that the next bond for the community wouldn't be until spring of 2024.
Okay.
And that the use of these funds would essentially replace what would have been a bond.
So I apologize. I wasn't able to attend the finance committee meeting. What can't we use this money for? Or is it the sky's the limit?
It's probably important to explain why the verbiage was so generic and vague on the bond. Boroughs around the state, when bond debt was vetoed, responded to it differently. If you look at Matsu, they never increased local property taxes for any of those years of state bond debt veto. Instead, they took it from roads, parks and rec, every other area. They used federal impact money to help pay towards operational costs so they could use the tax money that would have gone to their general fund and instead apply that towards bond debt. If you look around the state, there were so many different ways. Some boroughs used their own fund balance to pay it and didn't have to pull it from other sources. So the intent of the legislation, and I'm pretty sure we still have a legislator in the room, the intent was to allow the boroughs flexibility because there wasn't a one size fits all when it came to passing the debt over to the borough and how they responded. So therefore it couldn't be a one size fits all in the bills that passed. So it's pretty broad flexibility. Matsu could very well go back to the road projects that the money originally came from, but likely it's been several years now. They found some other money to do that. So there's not going to be an accounting where it goes back to the one road that Matsu was going to build that's since built. And so there is no clean way to trace that money back. And so the language is vague by design and for that reason.
Thank you. Member Higgins.
Yeah, I guess with the bond issue that we had a bigger discussion somewhat about whether you want to go one big bond, whether we want to break it up, that sort of thing, and how we would do it. So what we may do in the next 2023, from my perspective, is do we have some areas that are bond related that we may want to do, but coming out with a $110 million bond and put everything all together and hope it sinks or swim may not be the most successful. But if we've got safety issues to address, we have a lot of other issues to do, I think that would be strong public support for that. And so I don't want to necessarily, from my perspective, assume that we won't go forward with something that is really critical from our standpoint to go forward with. So I leave it a little bit open, but I think the idea of a $110 million bond is a bit overwhelming. It's every other year. It has some advantages for us, particularly for the planning, for the people we have doing these projects. They don't know whether they're going to have activities for the following year because we don't have something that if it is not approved, what happens next year with staffing and how do we do it? And I understand that, but it still becomes a public kind of support. And I think we do better looking at that option.
I think you'll find the administration, when we come up with a recommendation, final recommendation, whether we do a bond or not, will really depend on the amount of these funds that the board chooses to use, because there aren't enough assets and resources in this city to do more than what can be done. If you look at security vestibules, the most we're going to be able to get each year is 6. So if a large amount of this were to be used for capital construction projects, we would have to look at resources in the city to even do more projects. And if we believed that they just didn't exist, then we would come back and be honest with the board and say that really we think we've got 3 or 4 years worth of projects. And that would be just as much logic as to why we wouldn't bond as anything else. We're seeing 20% increases nearly across the board. And a lot of that is shortage of labor, just like every restaurant and bus in town.
Thank you. Member
I think that your comment about what the workforce is capable of doing in a calendar year is a really important parameter. I would be interested in better understanding as the administration creates a list of prioritized capital needs, what is possible to do and be shovel ready essentially, starting in I don't know, May, June 2023. So if we can only do 6 vestibules in 2023, then maybe what are those 6 vestibules rather than, forgive me for not remembering how many there were on the bond, right? We prepared it for a 2-year bond. So I guess what are the most urgent needs that need to be addressed for students' day-to-day health, safety, not navigating leaky roofs or backed up sewage systems?
Right, we can certainly do that. When you look at one-time funds, it doesn't mean you have to spend it really fast. It just means it sits in your capital funds account until the projects are exhausted, just like when you sell a bond. The only difference is when you sell a bond, you have 3 years because of arbitrage rules to spend every penny that you sold, or you take a penalty. With these funds, it doesn't mean if you preserve them for specific uses that the project has to be done in a year. But what it does mean is if the number is large, if the board goes that way, then it wouldn't make sense to do a bond that you're not even going to be able to start those projects for 3 or 4 years, potentially, because the board has already have enough capital projects on the plate with these funds that we have. That's why you would push a bond off if you knew you weren't even going to start it for any of them for 2 or 3 years. Really, your cost estimates and your ability to have accurate estimates that far out is not, it might not be wise to do a bond for that reason.
Is this part of the survey? Will these questions be on the survey we're putting out for the community to give us input on? I absolutely value the administration's priorities, but are we going to, is that part of the conversation we're going to also have with the public?
We can maybe do something separate. I would like the general fund, the operating fund, those questions and those concerns separate from the state bond debt reimbursement.
I'm referring to the state bond debt reimbursement.
I had not planned on, because I don't know if the board was just going to want to give it back to the taxpayers or use it.
Yeah.
If it looks like the board, whichever way the board goes.
Right. And I'm just trying to figure. Now, when you say give it back to the taxpayers, some people hear that and they think we're going to be giving money back to the taxpayers.
No, there won't be.
So can we?
I can articulate that. So if the board decides that the $87 million would go back to reduce future tax debt, what we would do is put it in the debt service fund. And at the back of the budget book, every budget book, at the very back is a page that shows the taxes we're requesting from the municipality for the operating fund and the taxes we're requesting from the municipality for debt, capital debt. If we were going to request $45 million from the municipality for fiscal year 24 in capital debt, but we had $87 million sitting in that fund, what we could do is not request any for capital debt that year. And in fact, it would lower their property taxes for that portion, not the operating fund, but for the capital fund. It would either eliminate or significantly lower their property taxes for that purpose. Depending on how you did it, you could spread it for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Or you could try to spend it down as quickly as possible, give the taxpayers maximum relief. If you're concerned about, the inflationary drivers in our community, and that discussion as to whether we would spend it down over 2 or 3 or 5 years could happen after the budget's approved. Mm-hmm. Initially, it would just be, are we going to request taxes for fiscal year 24 if the board reserved it? And we would work that out. We could provide multiple opportunities, but it all depends on how much money still remains after the board chooses to use it on projects as to how much impact you could have on reducing taxes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Member Jacobs?
Yep, thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the information in the presentation. I think the data point I requested earlier regarding the intersection of the bond holiday versus the debt service and what that lever does, depending upon where the board moves it, I think is going to be important for me as to which direction we go in totality. But I think that it's ultimately reasonable to use some of these funds for projects that especially prioritize student and staff safety. And so that's something that I'm in favor of. And whether we choose to use the whole amount or a hybrid, I think that probably needs to be further discussed.
Thank you. Other questions? Member Lessons?
Not a question, but I just wanted to express my support for a couple of the check boxes, both for considering that bond holiday and spending what the burden of hand that we have on capital projects, knowing that materials may cost less in the summer of 2023 than they do in the summer of 2024 or 2025. I think it makes sense in my head that the value of $1 will be greater earlier on a timeline than in 3 or 4 or 5 years. I'm thinking about if we go back on the vestibules and the security cameras, right? A couple of years ago, I think that the CIP had those pegged at $9 million, and then it went up to 16 million, and now we're seeing that it is 19 million. That's a lot of growth for the same number of vestibules. That's pretty profound. So I'd like to know what we can do with what we have.
Thank you. Did you want to comment, Mr. Anderson?
I can't recall which board member said it, so I apologize, but maybe someone on Zoom. But it was an interpretation of taxpayer relief. And it might have been Member Holloman. I don't recall. Was you could look at it a couple different ways. If you spend the state bond debt reimbursement, then you're still completing construction for district priorities, but not increasing future taxes for property owners in Anchorage on the private and business side. So when I say give back to the taxpayer, people actually can interpret that 2 different ways. So whoever said that, I probably didn't word it right on the slide, but I know there are a couple different ways of looking at reducing community taxes.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our work session. I want to thank you, both of you, for a great presentation, lots of information. I really like the layout of how we're going to move through these next few months. Dr. Bryant, any other comments before we adjourn to executive session?
No, we look forward to continuing to engage the board and community on this process as it relates to our financial shortfall. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn into executive session for the purpose of legal update, student hearings, negotiations, and contracts.
Madam President, so moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. We are adjourned to executive session.